question is there any biblical evidence that Christians gathered on Sunday, the first day of the week?
So the text used to try and show that the church gathered on Sunday is, of course, Acts 20, verse 7. And this is perhaps the most common text I've seen used to try and prove that. However, when you study the text, what we find is actually quite the opposite. Now, I love the King James, that's what this version is, but it does translate this scripture incorrect. For example, the word day there is italics, and in the King James when the word is in italics, that means it's not in the Greek. Now, when we look in the Greek, what we actually find is the word they're using for week is actually sabbaton, Sabbath. And when you study the language in the Greek, we find some very interesting things. For example, the word for first actually means one. So this scripture isn't saying they gathered on the first day of the week. It's saying they gathered on one of the Sabbaths. And this just so happened to be one of the Sabbaths that Paul was around. This is one of Paul's many missionary journeys. He was getting ready to depart and go somewhere else, and everybody wanted to hear him preach for as long as they could. He was a very gifted and eloquent speaker. And it says he preached until midnight. In fact, this is the story, if you read the context, where Eutychus fell out of the window because Paul was preaching so long. And he fell out of the window because he was asleep. And actually, the Good News Bible translates this verse more accurately. It says on Saturday evening. The reality of the situation, friends, is that no text in the book of Acts or anywhere in the New Testament shows that the church gathered on Sunday. They broke bread together daily, yes, but breaking bread does not sanctify a day. But what we do find is that the early church continued to keep the Sabbath for decades after Jesus died and rose again. In fact, in the book of Acts, we find 84 Sabbaths recorded as being kept by Paul and the apostles and the early church. Never once do we find Sunday honored as a Sabbath or honored as the Lord's Day anywhere in Acts or the New Testament. The only time you find anybody connected with Israel keeping Sunday was when they were in complete apostasy to God, and keeping Sunday was one of the signs of being in apostasy to God. And many people will claim, well, we keep Sunday in honor of the resurrection. Show me the scripture that commands that then. Because the reality is, no scripture in the Bible commands us to honor Sunday in honor of the resurrection. No scripture commands us to honor Sunday for any reason. In fact, Jesus himself in Matthew 24:20 commanded us to be keeping the Sabbath long after his death and resurrection. You just never found the early church keeping Sunday, but you always found them keeping the Sabbath.